Melissa Collins frowned at the ledger in her grandmother Eleanor's luxurious study. In contrast to the spring sunlight of Boston shining through the window, her heart was covered by dark shadows. "There's no mistaking it," she murmured. With her training as an accountant, Melissa's eyes had detected clear traces of misappropriation in the work she had begun intending to help with her grandmother's asset management. Her mother Barbara's high-end art sales business and her sister Diane's real estate investment project with her husband. Both had failed, and all of the enormous debts were in her grandmother Eleanor's name. "What are you doing, Melissa?" Startled by the sudden voice, Melissa turned around. Barbara was standing at the entrance of the room. "I'm just checking grandmother's financial situation," Melissa feigned composure. "Our family is managing mother's assets properly. There are several strange points. Especially the financing for your business and the investment in Diane and her husband's project. Does grandmother really know about these?" A flash of anxiety appeared in Barbara's eyes. "Of course. Mother said she wanted to support the family business. But both have failed, haven't they? Is there a repayment plan?" "That's none of your business," Barbara said coldly. "There will be a family meeting tonight. Everyone should attend." That evening, the Collins family dining room was filled with tension. Richard, Melissa's father, sat with Barbara and Diane on either side of him. Diane's husband Jonathan was also present. "Today's meeting is about our family's honor and trust," Richard declared. "It seems Melissa has questions about how we manage our assets." "I'm simply pointing out the facts," Melissa said. "Huge sums of money have flowed from grandmother's assets into your businesses. And all those businesses have failed. Isn't this clearly misappropriation?" "Misappropriation?" Barbara's voice trembled with anger. "We're managing the assets to protect mother." "That's right," Diane agreed. "Grandmother wishes for the family's prosperity by supporting our businesses. You know grandmother has early symptoms of dementia, don't you?" Melissa questioned. "Can you say for certain that she truly understood what she was signing?" "Melissa." Richard's voice thundered. "What are you saying?" "The evidence indicates so." Melissa pulled out the documents she had prepared. "Especially the signatures from last year are clearly different from previous ones. Did someone forge them? What are you planning?" Diane's face reddened. "Do you want to keep grandmother's inheritance all to yourself?" "No. I just want to protect grandmother. We love and respect mother." Barbara stood up. "Though an outsider like you might not understand. I intend to tell grandmother the truth," Melissa said with determination. "She has the right to know." Richard's face turned red with anger at these words. "Unforgivable. You're trying to betray the family. Get out of this house." "Dad." "Richard is right." Barbara's expression tightened. "If Melissa stays in the house, it will only cause mother unnecessary worry. Your presence is what's disrupting the family's peace," Diane said coldly. "Are you serious?" "I'm being thrown out for trying to protect grandmother." "Get out," Richard said in a low voice. "Never show your face again. You are no longer a member of our family." That night, Melissa left the Collins mansion, dragging a single suitcase containing only her limited belongings. As she walked down the dark street, Melissa's cell phone rang. It was from an unknown number. "Melissa." It was the weak voice of her grandmother Eleanor. "What happened?" "I heard you suddenly left." "Grandma." "Tell me the truth." Eleanor's voice regained its former strength. "I may be old, but I'm not foolish. There's a lot to tell you. But not over the phone." "I understand," Eleanor said quietly. "I'll contact you tomorrow through my lawyer. We'll find a way to meet without anyone knowing." 8 years passed. Melissa Collins was brewing coffee in her apartment kitchen when she received the call. From the other end of the line came a calm male voice. This is William Harrison, Eleanor Collins' attorney. Melissa's hand trembled. Contact from her grandmother Eleanor's lawyer usually came as a monthly regular report. But today was unscheduled. Has something happened? I have sad news. Harrison's voice grew even quieter. Eleanor passed away peacefully last night. Melissa leaned against the kitchen counter. For 8 years, she had kept in secret contact with her grandmother. Sometimes through the lawyer, sometimes through a trusted nurse, all without the family's knowledge. But she knew her grandmother's health had been deteriorating recently. The funeral will be held the day after tomorrow at St. Mary's Church in Boston, Harrison continued. And it was Eleanor's strong wish that you attend. The family? They have been informed. According to Eleanor's will, your attendance is essential. Melissa took a deep breath. I understand. I'll be there. She hung up the phone and walked to the window. It had been a long journey since that night 8 years ago when she was driven from her home. She had kept in secret contact with her grandmother, gathering evidence, preparing for the day when the truth would be revealed. And now, that day had come. Melissa said softly, "Grandma, I promise to fulfill your wishes." 2 days later, Melissa was climbing the steps of St. Mary's Church in Boston. Dressed in black mourning attire, she kept her back straight. Though her heart was beating rapidly, her expression remained calm. Upon reaching the church doors, she took a deep breath and pushed open the heavy doors. The church interior was filled with flowers and their fragrance. Many attendees were already seated, and the sound of quiet conversation floated in the air. However, the moment Melissa entered, the atmosphere changed. As if an electric current had run through the room, conversations stopped, and all eyes turned to her. In the front family seats sat her mother Barbara, father Richard, sister Diane, and her husband Jonathan. Barbara was the first to notice her. Her eyes widened, and her face contorted. "Why did you come?" Barbara's voice was low but trembling with anger and disgust. "I wish you had died instead." Melissa flinched at those words but continued to move forward. Next, her sister Diane stood up. A cold smile played on her beautiful face. "Who invited you?" Diane said sarcastically. "Don't embarrass everyone, you disgrace." A murmur spread among the attendees. Many people were confused by the sudden appearance of the daughter who had been disowned 8 years ago. Melissa quietly approached and stopped in front of the family. She looked straight at her mother and sister and said quietly, "I'm not here to pay my respects. I'm here to reveal the truth." Those words spread through the church like a stone thrown into water. The color drained from Barbara's face, and Diane tightly gripped her husband's arm. "Get out," Richard said in a low voice. He stood up and tried to grab Melissa's arm. "Mr. Richard Collins." At the sudden voice, everyone turned around. William Harrison, the lawyer, stood in the central aisle. Next to him was another man with a stern expression. "I am James Foster, the executor of Eleanor Collins' will," the other man said. "Melissa Collins' attendance has been explicitly requested by the deceased's will. Any attempt to remove her would be contrary to the deceased's final wishes." Richard lowered his hand, his face flushed. Barbara covered her mouth with a trembling hand, and Diane glared at the lawyers. "This is a family matter," Diane said coldly. "We will not yield to legal threats." "Not threats, just stating facts," Harrison replied politely. "The reading of the will is scheduled to take place afterward, as planned. And Melissa's presence is essential." The funeral began amidst tense silence. Melissa sat in a seat away from the family. She sent her gaze to her grandmother's coffin and spoke to her in her heart. "I'm here, grandmother. As promised." Throughout the ceremony, Melissa occasionally looked toward the family. Barbara was visibly upset, wiping away tears multiple times. However, it wasn't clear whether this was from genuine sadness or from fear. Diane frequently exchanged whispers with her husband and occasionally glanced anxiously at Melissa. Only Richard maintained a stone-like expressionless face. As the funeral ended and attendees began to leave, Lawyer Harrison approached Melissa. "The reading of the will take place in a separate room. Just the Collins family and you." Melissa nodded. "I'm ready." As they moved to a small conference room on the side of the church, Barbara suddenly blocked Melissa's path. "What are you plotting?" Her voice was mixed with fear. "After 8 years without contact, you suddenly appear." "There was no contact because you drove me out," Melissa replied calmly. "But it was different with grandmother." Barbara's face turned pale. What do you mean?" "You'll know everything soon," Melissa said, passing by Barbara and entering the conference room. The small conference room had a heavy wooden table with chairs arranged around it. Through the windows, a cloudy sky was visible, making the room dim. Melissa sat in a chair near the entrance, while Harrison and the executor Foster positioned themselves at the end of the table. A few minutes later, Barbara, Richard, Diane, and Jonathan entered the room. They sat in seats furthest from Melissa. In the silence that dominated the room, Harrison opened a large folder containing documents. "Now, I will begin the reading of Eleanor Adelaide Collins' final will." Melissa stared straight ahead. The time had come to fulfill her promise to her grandmother. Lawyer Harrison cleared his throat lightly and looked down at the documents. The air in the conference room was heavy, with only the sound of the clock's second hand slicing through the silence. "I will now read the contents of Eleanor Adelaide Collins' final will and testamentary supplement." He began reading in a solemn tone. After the opening legal language and formal words, he entered the substantive content. "I, Eleanor Adelaide Collins, being of sound mind, direct the distribution of my estate as follows." Barbara straightened her back, and Diane tightly gripped her husband's hand. Richard maintained his expressionless face. Only Melissa sat quietly with a calm expression. "First, I donate 70% of my total assets to the Silver Defenders Foundation, which works to prevent financial abuse of the elderly." Shock ran through the room. Barbara gasped, and Diane involuntarily exclaimed, "What?" "Second, I bequeath 25% of my assets to my granddaughter, Melissa Elizabeth Collins." "This is unacceptable." Barbara suddenly stood up. Her face was distorted with anger. "There must be some mistake." "Barbara, sit down," Harrison said sternly. "We're not finished yet." Barbara grabbed the chair with trembling hands and slowly sat down. Her eyes reflected a mixture of anger and fear. "Third, the remaining 5% will be equally divided among my daughter Barbara Collins, granddaughter Diane Harris, and son-in-law Richard Collins." Diane, her face red, shouted, "Just 5%? To share? This is clearly unfair." "Furthermore," Harrison continued, raising his voice, "I appoint Melissa Elizabeth Collins as the executor of this will. She is given full authority to manage my entire estate and execute the above distribution." Richard showed his first reaction. The color drained from his face, and his hands began to shake. "I will legally contest this," he said in a low voice. "Eleanor's judgment was impaired in her later years. This will is invalid." Melissa quietly replied, "Grandmother's mental state was confirmed by regular evaluations from multiple physicians. Even at the time this will was created, grandmother was fully competent to make decisions." "You manipulated grandmother." Diane raised an accusatory voice. "Disappearing for years, then suddenly returning to steal the inheritance." Harrison shook his head. "Diane, that's not true. Eleanor and Melissa were in regular contact for the past 8 years." "What?" Barbara's voice was trembling. "Furthermore," Harrison continued, "there is a supplement to the will. He took out another envelope. This was written by Eleanor 1 week before she passed away. Opening the envelope and taking out the paper, the lawyer paused slightly before beginning to read. To my beloved family. By the time this letter is read, I will no longer be in this world. However, I cannot leave without revealing the truth that has weighed heavily on my heart. Barbara and Diane exchanged glances, wearing anxious expressions. 8 years ago, my granddaughter Melissa discovered that the family was misappropriating my assets. She tried to tell me, but was prevented by the rest of the family and driven from the house. That's a lie, Barbara exclaimed. However, Melissa and I continued to communicate secretly. With her help, I gradually regained control of my property management and investigated the truth. Harrison continued. As a result, it was discovered that my daughter Barbara, granddaughter Diane, her husband Jonathan, and son-in-law Richard had fraudulently obtained loans in my name and misappropriated assets totaling over $2 million. This is slander. Richard slammed his fist on the table. I'll sue. You can sue, Executor Foster spoke for the first time. But Eleanor has left detailed records and evidence of all transactions. And they have already been submitted to the prosecuting authorities. The room fell into frozen silence. Barbara covered her face with both hands, and Diane tightly gripped Jonathan's arm. Harrison continued reading. For a long time, I had hoped that my family would acknowledge their mistakes and apologize honestly. But unfortunately, such an opportunity never came. I entrust Melissa with the responsibility of revealing the truth. She is the only family member who never betrayed my trust until the end. Barbara broke down in tears. Mother, why? Harrison folded the letter and placed it on the table. Tomorrow at 10 a.m., a detailed disclosure of evidence will take place at this office. The attendance of all concerned parties is required. The room was enveloped in heavy silence. Barbara, wiping her tears with a handkerchief, said in a trembling voice, Melissa, what did you whisper to grandmother? Why did you turn her against us? Melissa quietly stood up. I didn't whisper anything. I just helped grandmother know the truth. She paused for a moment, choosing her words carefully before continuing. For 8 years, grandmother and I kept in secret contact. During that time, grandmother came to know all the truth. Lies. Diane's voice trembled. Grandmother had dementia. You manipulated her. Eleanor's cognitive abilities were regularly tested by independent experts, Foster calmly explained. All records are available. Richard stood up and took a step toward Melissa. You have destroyed the family. His voice was low and had a dangerous resonance. That's what you all did yourselves. Melissa didn't flinch. You deceived grandmother and misappropriated her assets, didn't you? Jonathan spoke for the first time. Let's see this so-called evidence. There must be some misunderstanding. His tone pretended to be calm, but sweat had appeared on his forehead. Tomorrow, all evidence will be presented, Harrison said as he returned the documents to the folder. And they have already been submitted to the judicial authorities. Barbara suddenly approached Melissa. Her eyes were red with tears, and her whole body was trembling. Melissa, please, we're family. I'm your mother. Melissa took a step back. 8 years ago, you drove me out of the family. At that time, I wasn't family to you. But all evidence will be presented tomorrow, Melissa said calmly. And you will face the consequences of your actions. Diane suddenly turned on her husband. This is your fault. You said, it'll be fine, no one will find out. Jonathan defended himself while distancing himself from his wife. It wasn't just me. We all decided this together. Enough, Harrison raised his voice. This meeting is over. We'll see you at tomorrow's gathering. Melissa quietly stood up and tried to leave the room. Barbara grabbed her arm. Wait, please. Melissa gently removed her mother's hand and said, "We'll talk tomorrow." As she left the room, Melissa exhaled deeply while walking down the long corridor. For 8 years, she had prepared for this day. And finally, her grandmother's wishes were about to be realized. The next morning, a clear blue sky stretched overhead. Melissa stood in front of the Harrison law firm and took a deep breath. In her hands, she held a thick file of documents. It was the crystallization of 8 years of investigation and evidence gathering. Entering the building and taking the elevator to the 14th floor, tension was already palpable in front of the conference room. Barbara, Richard, Diane, and Jonathan stood separately, not exchanging words with each other. The shock of the previous day had already begun to crack the family bonds. "Good morning," Melissa greeted matter-of-factly. They acknowledged her only with silent nods. Diane's eyes were red, suggesting she had been crying all night. Barbara seemed more composed than the day before, but her hands trembled slightly. Richard looked tired, but there was a hint of resignation on his face. In contrast, Jonathan wore a confident smile. "We've been waiting for you." Harrison opened the conference room door and invited them in. In the conference room, chairs were arranged along a large table, and a large screen was installed on the wall. Next to Executor Foster sat a woman Melissa was meeting for the first time. "This is Prosecutor Jennifer Morris," Foster introduced the woman. "She is attending as the prosecutor in charge of this case." The color drained from Barbara's face. "Prosecutor." Given the nature of the evidence, it was determined that attendance from a legal perspective was necessary, Harrison explained in a matter-of-fact manner. After everyone was seated, Melissa opened the file and stood in front of the screen. "Before we begin, I have one question," she looked around at the family. "This is your opportunity to speak honestly. Do you admit to misappropriating grandmother's assets?" Silence continued. Barbara stared at the floor, Richard remained expressionless with his arms folded. Diane bit her lip. "A ridiculous question," Jonathan suddenly spoke up. "We did nothing wrong. Eleanor was fully aware of everything." Melissa nodded. "I understand. Then I will show the facts." She displayed the first slide on the screen. It showed records of transactions with dates and amounts. These are a series of loans made in grandmother's name from 2015 to 2017. A total of $870,000 flowed into Barbara's art gallery business. Barbara looked up. "Mother wanted to support my business." "Then please explain this email." Melissa displayed the next slide. It showed an email from Barbara to Richard. "I was able to successfully forge Mother's signature. The bank didn't suspect anything. This is an email you sent in June 2015. Barbara gasped. "I never sent such an email." "All emails were recovered from grandmother's computer system," Melissa calmly explained. "It seems you also had access to grandmother's computer." Next, Melissa turned to Diane and Jonathan. "From 2016 to 2018, you obtained loans of $1.15 million in grandmother's name and invested in Southern real estate development." "That was a legitimate investment," Jonathan insisted. "What about this, then?" Melissa displayed the next slide. "After the project failed, you withdrew an additional $480,000 from grandmother's account and transferred it to a personal overseas account." Diane's face turned pale. "That was, And most shocking is this," Melissa said quietly. The next slide displayed medical records. 3 months before grandmother was diagnosed with dementia, you already knew about her declining cognitive abilities. And you continued to exploit that to misappropriate assets. Lies. Richard stood up. "We cherished her." "Then listen to this recording." Melissa pressed a button. Richard's voice resonated in the room. "Eleanor doesn't remember anything anymore. It's easy to get her to sign documents. Our plan is perfect. Richard collapsed into his chair. How? After hearing my initial suspicions 8 years ago, grandmother installed recording devices in her room, Melissa explained. She was beginning to feel symptoms of dementia, but her judgment was still intact. Barbara began to cry. I loved Mother, just, my business wasn't doing well. And this is the final evidence. Melissa displayed the final slide. It showed a still image from a video message recorded by Eleanor in her own voice. Grandmother left a video recording of all the facts while her will and judgment were clear. Jonathan suddenly became aggressive. This evidence was illegally collected. It won't be recognized. Prosecutor Morris spoke for the first time. All this evidence was collected through legally recognized methods. Eleanor Collins had formally authorized all investigations concerning her property. The conference room was enveloped in heavy silence. Barbara continued to cry. Diane distanced herself from Jonathan and gave him an accusatory look. Richard appeared completely defeated. I'll explain the next steps, Prosecutor Morris continued. A formal investigation into fraud and embezzlement charges will begin. Everyone will be interviewed, and afterward, we'll decide whether to press charges. You mean prison? Diane's voice trembled. It depends on the weight of the evidence and your cooperative attitude, the prosecutor replied. Melissa said quietly, until the end, grandmother hoped that you would admit your wrongdoing and apologize honestly. If you had, she intended to refrain from legal measures. But it's too late now, isn't it? Barbara said, wiping her tears with a handkerchief. The legal consequences cannot be avoided. Melissa chose her words carefully. But there is still an opportunity to speak honestly about everything. That was grandmother's wish. The atmosphere in the room changed. Barbara took a deep breath and began speaking in a trembling voice. I started it. The financing for Mother's business initially had her consent. But when the business began to fail, I needed more money. She choked on her words. I couldn't tell Mother. I didn't want to disappoint her. Diane also confessed tearfully. Jonathan said, it'll be fine, no one will notice. At first, it was meant to be an investment, but soon. Stop. Jonathan interrupted his wife. Don't say anything. Not a word without a lawyer. It's over, Jonathan, Diane said quietly. We were wrong. Richard silently bowed his head. Melissa. He finally spoke. I regret driving you out that day. You were right. Melissa looked at her father. A complex mixture of emotions filled her heart. You betrayed grandmother. And me too, she said quietly. But grandmother loved you all until the end. Prosecutor Morris, taking notes, said, everyone, please report to the prosecutor's office at 9 a.m. tomorrow. We will record formal statements. The meeting ended. As Melissa gathered her documents, she felt Barbara approaching. Melissa. Barbara's voice was weak. Aren't we family anymore? Melissa looked at her mother. After a long silence, she answered, you need to reconsider what family means. She quietly left the room. Looking back in the hallway, there was no longer the strong family she once knew, only individuals left in pieces. Melissa thought that it wasn't the truth that tore them apart, but their own actions. A year passed. The former Eleanor Collins mansion in the Boston suburbs had been reborn as the Eleanor Collins Senior Support Center. Melissa stood on the spacious veranda, gazing at the garden trees that were beginning to show their fall colors. In her hand, she held the first annual report of the newly established Eleanor Collins Foundation. In this year, the foundation had launched programs to prevent financial abuse of the elderly and had already helped dozens of seniors. It's going better than I expected, grandmother, Melissa said softly to the sky. It had been a tumultuous year. Barbara and Diane were charged with fraud and embezzlement. Barbara, considering her age and health condition, received a suspended sentence. Diane and her husband Jonathan received prison sentences, and Jonathan was still serving his time. Richard escaped charges due to a lack of decisive evidence of complicity, but he completely lost his credibility in Boston's social and business circles, and his business collapsed. Melissa picked up her coffee cup and walked to a corner of the garden that her grandmother had loved most. There was a small bench where Eleanor had often sat reading books in her later years. "I kept my promise, grandmother," Melissa said quietly. "The truth has been revealed." Melissa's cell phone rang. The screen displayed "Mother." After the trial, Barbara and Melissa had slowly begun to repair their relationship. It wasn't an easy journey, but Barbara recognized her mistakes and was making sincere efforts to make amends. "Hello, Mother," Melissa answered the phone. "Melissa, how are you today? Are the preparations for the center going well?" Barbara's voice had a gentleness and humility that wasn't there before. "Yes, we're making final adjustments for next week's opening. Is there anything I can help with?" After thinking for a moment, Melissa replied, "Actually, we need a few more volunteers for senior support. If you're interested." "Gladly," Barbara immediately replied. "I want to do what I can for Mother's sake too." After ending the call, Melissa gazed at the clouds in the sky. It would still take a long time to fully repair the damaged family bonds. But they had taken small steps. Melissa returned to the study and picked up a book placed on the desk. "Silent Justice: The Truth and Prevention of Elder Financial Abuse," a book she had written based on her own experience. 3 months after publication, it had already generated much response. Outside the window, new staff members were busily working toward the center's opening. They were like a new family to Melissa, comrades sharing the same aspirations. Melissa looked at her grandmother's photo and smiled. "Grandmother was right that happiness can't be built on lies," she said softly. "But on truth, we can build new beginnings." She left the study and began walking toward the future. Despite carrying the pain of the past, she was determined to transform it into something meaningful.